equals lone. Cowboy lived 9 years in solitude, until an Apache woman came into his life. He was a man in his late 30s, strong, tall, and rugged, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that had seen more hardship than joy. Once, he had been part of a small, loving family, his wife, Margaret, and their young daughter, Lily. They had lived in a modest house near the outskirts of a small Arizona town, the kind of town where everybody knew each other, where neighbors waved from porches, and the sound of children playing could be heard in every street. Samuel loved that life. He loved his family. But in one cruel twist of fate, it was all taken from him in a single, tragic accident. The memory of that day haunted him endlessly. The day the fire swept through their home. He had tried desperately to save them, but the flames moved too fast. By the time he emerged, choking on smoke, the house was gone. So were Margaret and Lily. The weight of his grief crushed him, and for months afterward, he wandered through the town like a ghost, doing the motions of life but feeling nothing. Friends and neighbors reached out, offering comfort, meals, and invitations, but he pushed them all away. He could not face the town, nor the life that reminded him of what he had lost. It was during one late summer morning, after months of restless wandering, that Samuel decided he could no longer remain in town. He packed a few belongings, saddled his horse, and rode toward the vast, untamed lands of northern Arizona. The mountains stretched endlessly, with valleys hidden beneath canopies of sagebrush, and the sun casting golden light over the ridges. He did not have a map, nor any specific destination. He only knew he needed to be alone. The open plains called to him, promising peace, or at least, distance from the pain that had taken over his life. For 9 long years, Samuel lived alone in a small cabin he built with his own hands. It was a simple structure of wood and stone, sturdy enough to withstand the harsh winters and the blazing summers. He had carved it into the side of a hill, overlooking a wide valley where wild cattle roamed. The cabin had a single room, a fireplace for warmth, and a small loft where he slept. Though it was humble, it became his sanctuary. Here, he could exist without the constant reminders of the life he had lost. His days began with the rising sun. Samuel would wake early, stoke the fire, and drink a small cup of coffee before heading out to tend to his livestock. He raised a few cows and some goats, living off the land as best as he could. Hunting and fishing supplemented his diet, and he learned to prepare what the land provided with skill. He became adept at reading the weather, tracking animals, and finding water in places where most would have given up. Survival became a daily routine, and in those routines he found a sense of purpose, however small. The solitude was at first unbearable. The first winter alone tested his resolve. Nights were long, and the wind howled through the valley like a lonely spirit. Samuel would sit by the fire, staring into the flames, remembering his family and wishing desperately for just one more conversation, one more hug. He often spoke aloud, telling stories of Margaret and Lily to the empty room, as if their spirits were still listening. There was no one to judge him, no one to pity him, and slowly he began to find comfort in the silence. Seasons passed, each bringing its own challenges. Summers were scorching and water was always scarce. Samuel dug wells, learned to store rainwater, and built fences to protect his livestock from predators. In winter, snow could fall in heavy blankets, and he would spend days trapped indoors, repairing tools, chopping firewood, and planning for the months ahead. The rhythm of life became predictable, almost meditative. He learned to appreciate the little things, the smell of wet earth after rain, the songs of birds at dawn, the crackle of the fire at night. Samuel did not entirely avoid human contact. Occasionally, he rode into nearby towns to trade furs, meat, or milk for supplies he could not produce. But these visits were brief. He spoke little, listened more, and always returned to the solitude of his cabin as quickly as possible. People in town whispered about him, calling him the lone cowboy, a man who had disappeared from the world, leaving only questions behind. Some were curious, some sympathetic and others wary, but Samuel did not care. He had chosen this life, and he embraced it fully, even if it meant loneliness. Despite his isolation, Samuel's life was not without joy. He found beauty in the land around him. Sunsets painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and he often paused in his work to watch the light dance across the hills. He marveled at the stars, unspoiled by city lights, and spent hours learning the constellations. He discovered the songs of the rivers and the whispers of the trees, and slowly, these small wonders began to fill the emptiness in his heart. Nature became his companion, silent yet comforting. Yet even with these small joys, there were nights when grief would return with full force. He would lie awake, listening to the wind, remembering laughter that was gone forever. On such nights, he felt the full weight of 9 years of solitude. The human heart, he realized, could endure great suffering, but it also craved connection. Sometimes he wondered if he had abandoned himself as much as he had been abandoned by life. But the next morning he would rise with the sun, tending his animals, chopping wood, and continuing the routines that gave him a sense of control and peace. Over the years, Samuel became part of the land in a quiet, invisible way. Predators learned to avoid him. Animals recognized him as a presence but not a threat, and he moved through the wilderness with a skill and confidence that came only from years of intimate knowledge. He knew which berries were safe to eat, which trails led to fresh water, and how to avoid storms that could sweep across the plains in minutes. His survival depended not just on strength, but on patience, observation, and respect for the world around him. And so, for nearly a decade, Samuel Hayes lived in solitude, a man apart from society but deeply connected to the land. He had survived tragedy, found ways to endure, and learned to live with pain that never fully left him. His story was not one of adventure or heroism in the traditional sense. It was the story of quiet resilience, of a man learning to exist again, day by day, in a world that had taken everything from him. Little did he know, the life he had built, so carefully isolated from human touch, was about to be changed forever. A meeting that would seem impossible in such remote solitude was approaching, a meeting that would challenge everything he thought he knew about loneliness, trust, and love. One crisp morning, as the sun began to rise and cast a golden glow across the valley, Samuel saddled his horse and rode toward the northern ridge, checking the cattle grazing in the open plains. The air smelled of damp earth and sage, a comforting scent he had come to know as his own. As he rode, his eyes scanned the hills, looking for any sign of trouble, a predator, a lost cow, or a storm rolling over the mountains. It was a morning much like any other, quiet and peaceful, yet that day, something unusual caught his eye. A figure moved slowly across a distant hill. At first, Samuel thought it might be a traveler passing through, or perhaps another rancher tending to livestock in a distant valley. But as he watched more closely, he realized it was a woman. Her hair was dark and long, tied loosely so it fluttered in the wind. She wore simple clothes, suitable for traveling across rough terrain, and led a small herd of goats along a narrow trail. There was a calmness in her movements, a quiet confidence that Samuel had not seen in a long time. He felt a curious stir inside him, one he hadn't experienced in years. The woman noticed him as well. She paused, shading her eyes from the sun, and studied him from a distance. Samuel's instinct was to retreat, to hide in the comfort of familiarity, but something about her presence felt gentle and non-threatening. He stayed where he was, observing, unsure whether to approach or simply watch from afar. For several minutes, they looked at each other across the valley, two solitary figures in a vast and empty land. Over the next few days, Samuel continued his routines, but he began noticing signs of the woman's presence more frequently. A trail of broken branches, the the distant sound of goats, the occasional smoke rising from a small fire on the far side of the ridge. All of these hinted that she was nearby. Samuel's curiosity grew. He wondered who she was, where she came from, and why she was traveling through this remote wilderness. He felt a mix of caution and intrigue, a combination that reminded him of a life before his isolation, when curiosity had been part of everyday existence. Eventually, their paths crossed directly. Samuel was guiding a stray cow back toward his pen when he saw the woman approaching along the rocky trail. Her steps were deliberate and steady, and her eyes met his with a quiet intensity. "Good morning," Samuel called out cautiously, his voice rough from years of speaking mostly to himself. She nodded in response, her expression calm and unreadable. There was no fear in her eyes nor any hint of hostility. Instead, there was a sense of understanding, a mutual recognition of two people who had spent too much time alone. "Are you from around here?" Samuel asked, keeping his tone neutral. He was used to solitude and small talk felt awkward, but he wanted to understand who this woman was. She shook her head. "No," she replied softly, her voice smooth and even. "I'm traveling with my goats. Just passing through these lands." Her words were simple, yet there was a quiet authority in her manner. Samuel noticed that she did not ask him personal questions, did not pry into his life. That lack of curiosity felt strange, but also comforting. In the following weeks, Samuel and the woman's encounters became more frequent. Sometimes, he saw her from a distance while tending his animals. Other times, their paths crossed near water sources or trails, forcing brief conversations. Each encounter was polite, respectful, and cautious. Samuel found himself talking more than he expected, sharing small details about the land, the weather, and his livestock. She listened attentively, occasionally offering advice on tracking or finding water. Her knowledge of the land was remarkable, and Samuel began to realize that she had spent her life moving through these areas with purpose and skill. Despite his natural reserve, Samuel felt an unfamiliar sense of companionship growing. The woman, whose name he later learned was Ayana, did not demand friendship or attention. She was simply present, steady and patient, allowing him to open up at his own pace. Over time, he began to look forward to seeing her, wondering what new insight or story she might share. Yana, in turn, seemed to appreciate Samuel's quiet strength and resilience. She noticed how carefully he observed the land, how attentive he was to his animals, and how he had created a life of order and routine in a place where chaos could arrive at any moment. One day, a sudden spring storm hit the valley. Dark clouds rolled in from the mountains, and wind tore through the plains, rattling Samuel's cabin and bending the trees. Samuel was rounding up his cattle when he noticed Ayana struggling to keep her goats together in the wind and rain. Without thinking, he rode toward her, offering help. Together, they guided the animals to a sheltered spot near a rock outcrop. The storm raged for hours, and they worked side by side in silence, coordinating their efforts with gestures and nods. It was the first time Samuel had worked closely with someone in nearly a decade, and he found a strange, quiet satisfaction in their cooperation. After the storm passed, they sat together on a flat rock, letting their animals graze nearby. Neither spoke for a long time, but Samuel felt a connection forming, a bond based not on words, but on shared experience and mutual respect. Yana eventually broke the silence, speaking softly about her travels, her family, and the skills she had learned from her people. Samuel listened, fascinated by her stories of survival, tradition, and life in harmony with the land. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of curiosity and wonder beyond his routines. Their friendship grew steadily, though cautiously. Samuel found himself teaching Ayana how to identify certain plants useful for food or medicine, while she showed him techniques for tracking, herding, and navigating the hills more efficiently. They exchanged stories around small fires in the evenings, sometimes laughing at the simplicity of life, other times falling silent in contemplation of the vast, open land around them. Samuel realized that he had been so focused on surviving alone that he had forgotten how enriching companionship could be. Even with growing trust, Samuel struggled internally. Years of isolation had built walls around his heart. He feared getting close, feared the vulnerability that connection required. There were times he would retreat, making excuses to leave the valley for a day, needing space to process the unfamiliar feelings stirring within him. But each time, Ayanna remained patient, never pushing him, never judging. Her calm presence allowed him to face his fears at his own pace, and slowly, the walls he had built began to show cracks. One afternoon, they discovered a small, hidden spring while exploring a narrow canyon. The water was clear and fresh, a hidden treasure in the rugged landscape. Samuel watched as Ayanna knelt to drink, her reflection mirrored in the still water. For a moment, he saw more than her presence. He saw the possibility of life beyond solitude, of sharing knowledge, joy, and challenges with someone who understood the land as deeply as he did. That moment stayed with him, planting the first seeds of hope he had felt in years. By the end of the season, Samuel and Ayanna had established an unspoken partnership. They respected each other's space, celebrated small victories together, and faced the challenges of the wilderness as a team when necessary. Samuel felt a sense of companionship he had never imagined he could experience again. The woman who had appeared in his life so quietly had brought with her not just curiosity, but a new perspective, one that reminded him that the world, even after tragedy, could still offer connection, trust, and understanding. Yet, Samuel also knew that their bond was fragile. He was still a man defined by solitude, and any disruption could cause him to retreat entirely. Ayanna understood this too, moving carefully, allowing the friendship to develop naturally. Both of them respected the space between them, and in doing so, they built the foundation for something far stronger than a passing friendship. It was a bond rooted in patience, trust, and shared experience, an extraordinary connection born in the most unlikely of places. As spring turned to summer, the valley seemed to change along with their relationship. The grass grew taller, rivers swelled with melted snow, and the animals thrived under their care. Samuel noticed that his days felt fuller, not because of work alone, but because of the quiet anticipation of sharing the land with someone else. He could not predict what the future would bring, but he felt a small, cautious hope that perhaps life could offer companionship again, even after years of isolation. After several months of cautious friendship, Samuel Hayes found himself in unfamiliar territory. He had spent 9 long years alone, building a life of solitude that had become both his safety and his identity. Yet, with Ayanna's presence, his routines, once predictable and comforting, began to shift. There was a subtle tension in him, a tug between the security of isolation and the gentle pull of companionship. He realized that living alongside another person required more than survival skills. It required patience, vulnerability, and trust, all of which he had buried deep inside him. Their days together were filled with practical work, tending cattle, checking traps, gathering firewood, and maintaining fences. Samuel had always taken pride in his abilities, but working with Ayanna introduced him to new methods and ideas. She moved with quiet confidence, guiding the goats with soft commands and keen observation. She taught him to read subtle signs in the land, the shape of clouds that warned of storms, the tracks of deer hidden among the underbrush, and the way the wind carried scents across the plains. Samuel marveled at her knowledge, realizing that he had much to learn even after nearly a decade in isolation. Despite the practical lessons, the emotional challenge was greater. Samuel struggled with the simple act of sharing space. He had grown accustomed to speaking only to himself, and the presence of another person brought an unfamiliar awareness of his thoughts and actions. Sometimes, he would rise before dawn, quietly tending the livestock, hoping to avoid interactions with Ayana. Other times, he would linger near the cabin, listening to her gentle humming or the soft sound of her footsteps, feeling a strange mix of comfort and unease. Ayana, however, was patient and perceptive. She understood the walls Samuel had built, and she never tried to force him to change. Instead, she offered quiet companionship, remaining nearby without crowding him. She would occasionally share stories of her own family, the traditions of her people, and the skills she had learned growing up on the land. Samuel listened, fascinated, yet wary of revealing his own story. Sharing his past felt like opening a door he had locked years ago, and he was unsure if he was ready to step through. Over time, small moments of connection began to emerge. One afternoon, while repairing a fence, Samuel cut his hand on a sharp piece of wood. Yana quickly cleaned and bandaged the wound, her hand steady and calm. He had spent years tending to injuries on his own, yet her touch carried a reassurance he could not ignore. The act was simple, almost ordinary, but it left a lasting impression on him. He began to recognize that trust and care could be shared without fear, and that vulnerability did not always lead to pain. Yet, despite these moments of closeness, Samuel often felt conflicted. His solitude had become a part of him, a shield against the unpredictable nature of life and the deep scars of his past. There were days when he would retreat to the hills, walking alone for hours, reflecting on his fears and uncertainties. He wondered whether he was ready for a life that involved another person, whether he could risk the emotional upheaval that connection might bring. Every step toward Ayana was accompanied by a step backward, a careful balancing act between desire and caution. The challenges of survival also tested their growing bond. One summer, a severe drought struck the valley. Water sources shrank, the grass turned brittle and brown, and the cattle became restless. Samuel and Ayana worked tirelessly to find alternative water, digging temporary wells and guiding the livestock to distant streams. The stress of the drought exposed both their strengths and vulnerabilities. They argued over strategies, sometimes frustrated by the limitations of their situation. But even in conflict, there was a growing respect. They learned to listen, to compromise, and to recognize the value of each other's perspective. Through these struggles, Samuel began to observe Ayana's resilience and patience. She never complained, never faltered under pressure. Her calm approach to challenges reminded him of the lessons he had learned in solitude: observation, patience, and perseverance. Yet her presence also highlighted the differences between them. Samuel's years of isolation had made him rigid, wary, and often slow to trust. Yana's openness and adaptability pushed him to confront habits he had developed as a means of survival. Slowly, he realized that living with another person required not just physical cooperation, but emotional growth as well. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat together by the fire, sharing a meal of roasted vegetables and dried meat. The sky was painted with shades of pink and orange, and the valley below glowed in the fading light. Samuel felt a rare sense of peace, yet also a quiet tension. He wanted to speak, to share his thoughts and fears, but words felt inadequate. Yana, sensing his hesitation, simply smiled and handed him a piece of bread. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried profound meaning, a reminder that connection could be nurtured in silence, through presence and shared experience. As the seasons changed, Samuel and Ayana faced other challenges together. Predators threatened the livestock, sudden storms tested their preparedness, and the harsh terrain demanded constant attention. Each challenge required cooperation, communication, and trust. Samuel found that he was learning to rely on another person in ways he had never imagined. The lessons extended beyond practical survival. He was discovering the value of partnership, empathy, and mutual respect. Yana's presence began to fill gaps in his life that he had long considered permanent, gaps he had thought would remain empty forever. Despite the growing bond, Samuel's inner struggles persisted. Memories of his family, the tragedy that had driven him into solitude, and the years spent alone surfaced unpredictably. Sometimes, he would retreat into the hills for days, seeking space to process the conflicting emotions of grief, trust, and emerging attachment. Yana respected his need for distance, never pressuring him, yet remaining a steady presence in the valley. It was a delicate balance, a test of patience and emotional endurance that neither of them had faced before. Slowly, Samuel realized that Ayana had become more than a companion in work. She had become a mirror for his emotions, a guide through uncharted territories of trust and connection. He noticed how her laughter could ease the weight of his thoughts, how her quiet observations often revealed truths he had ignored, and how her patience allowed him to confront fears he had carried for nearly a decade. He began to understand that human connection, though challenging, could bring strength as well as comfort. By the end of the year, their relationship had deepened significantly. Samuel found himself sharing small details of his past, memories of his family, the accident that had changed his life, and the years of solitude that followed. Ayana listened without judgment, offering empathy and understanding, rather than pity. The act of sharing and being heard was transformative for Samuel. He began to see that vulnerability, once feared, could lead to connection and healing. One late autumn day, as they worked together to gather firewood for the coming winter, Samuel paused to watch Ayana. She moved gracefully, her focus unwavering, and yet there was a softness in her presence that drew him in. For the first time in years, he considered the possibility of a life beyond isolation, a life where trust, care, and shared experiences could exist alongside independence. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, a prospect that challenged the very identity he had built over 9 years. The struggles of survival, combined with the growing emotional connection, created a delicate tension between them. Samuel often felt conflicted, torn between the comfort of solitude and the unfamiliar warmth of companionship. Yet, each shared challenge, each moment of trust, gradually eroded the barriers he had constructed. He realized that isolation, while safe, had also limited his potential for joy, growth, and human connection. Yana, with her quiet strength and patient presence, had become a catalyst for change, gently guiding him toward a more open, balanced life. By the time winter arrived, Samuel and Ayana had established a rhythm of cooperation, respect, and mutual understanding. They had faced physical challenges, navigated emotional complexities, and built a foundation of trust that neither had expected to find in such a remote place. Samuel recognized that their partnership was not merely convenient or circumstantial. It was a meaningful connection that had the potential to transform his life. For the first time in nearly a decade, he felt hope, curiosity, and the possibility of a future that included not just survival, but fulfillment and companionship. Winter had settled deeply into the valley, blanketing the hills and plains in a thick layer of snow. The wind howled through the canyons, bending trees and carrying ice-cold flakes that stung the skin. Samuel Hayes and Ayana had prepared as best they could, gathering extra firewood, securing the livestock, and storing enough food to last through the harsh weeks ahead. Yet, despite all precautions, the storm that arrived was fiercer than anything they had anticipated. The snow began falling in heavy sheets, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Samuel and Ayana huddled inside the cabin, watching as the world outside disappeared under white silence. The wind rattled the roof and howled through the cracks in the walls, and even the usually calm valley seemed alive with the storm's power. For hours, they worked together to secure the animals, ensuring they had shelter and enough warmth to survive. It was grueling work, exhausting both physically and mentally, yet neither complained. Survival demanded focus, and both of them understood that failure could have serious consequences. As night fell, the storm grew stronger. Samuel and Ayanna lit a fire in the hearth, its warm glow providing a small refuge from the cold and darkness. The cabin, usually a place of quiet routine and comfort, now felt confining. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm within Samuel's heart, chaotic, uncertain, and powerful. He realized that, for the first time in years, he depended not just on his own skills and instincts, but on someone else's presence, knowledge, and judgment. This dependency stirred a mix of emotions he had long suppressed: fear, relief, and a deep sense of vulnerability. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional moan of the wind. Samuel found himself watching Ayanna as she tended the fire and checked on the livestock. She moved calmly, efficiently, and without panic, yet there was an unspoken strength in her actions that comforted him. Her presence was grounding, a reminder that they could face even the harshest elements if they worked together. Still, he could not ignore the emotional truth rising within him, the realization that he was no longer alone, and that he could not remain fully closed off from human connection any longer. The night grew darker and colder, and Samuel began to feel the weight of his emotions pressing in. He had spent nearly a decade in solitude, building walls around his heart to protect himself from pain. Yet, in the shared struggle of survival, those walls began to crumble. He saw in Ayanna not just a companion, but a reflection of his own resilience, courage, and capacity for trust. For the first time, he questioned whether isolation had truly been a safe choice, or merely a way to avoid confronting the human need for connection and love. Unable to hold back his feelings any longer, Samuel finally spoke. "Yana," he began, his voice rough and uncertain, I need to tell you something." She looked up from tending the fire, her dark eyes attentive but patient. "What is it?" she asked softly. He swallowed hard, searching for the right words, struggling to articulate thoughts he had long buried. "I've been alone for so long," he said, "and I've built my life around that. I thought I could live without anyone, but being with you, seeing you here, it's changed me. I'm afraid of losing this connection, afraid of letting anyone in again." Jana listened quietly, her expression gentle and understanding. She did not interrupt, nor did she offer quick reassurances. Instead, she let him speak, giving him space to confront the emotions he had avoided for so many years. Samuel continued, voice trembling slightly. "I don't know if I can do this, trust, care, love again. But I also don't want to go back to the way I was. I need to know if we can face this together." For a long moment, silence filled the cabin. The wind outside roared against the walls, yet inside, there was a different kind of storm, a storm of fear, hope, and vulnerability. Finally, Ayanna spoke, her voice calm and steady. "Samuel, you've carried so much alone for so long. It's understandable to be afraid. But I'm here. I'm not leaving. We will face this together. You don't have to go back to being alone, not while I'm here." Her words were simple, yet they carried the weight of commitment, understanding, and unwavering support. At that moment, Samuel felt a surge of emotion he had not experienced in years. Tears pricked his eyes as the walls around his heart gave way. For the first time since his family's tragedy, he allowed himself to be vulnerable, not just with Ayanna, but with the life he had built, the fears he had carried, and the longing for connection he had suppressed. The storm outside mirrored the storm within him, and for the first time, he realized that vulnerability could bring strength, not weakness. The following days of the storm tested their newfound bond in practical ways. Snow blocked the trails, making it difficult to reach the livestock. Temperatures plummeted, and both of them spent hours ensuring the animals had enough food and warmth. Samuel observed Ayanna's resilience with admiration, noticing how she remained calm under pressure, offering practical solutions without panic. He realized that partnership was not about grand gestures, but about consistent support, shared responsibility, and mutual respect. One particularly cold morning, Samuel awoke to find Ayanna tending to the fire before dawn. The light of the fire cast soft shadows across her face, highlighting the determination and strength he had come to rely on. Without speaking, he joined her, and together they worked in silence, the rhythm of their cooperation both comforting and energizing. In that shared routine, Samuel recognized the beauty of connection, the way trust and understanding could create a foundation stronger than any wall built from fear or isolation. The storm eventually began to subside, leaving the valley coated in glistening snow, the sky a clear, pale blue. Samuel and Ayanna emerged from the cabin to survey the damage, checking the livestock and the land. The world felt renewed, the storm having tested their endurance and resilience. Yet, the greater test had been emotional. Samuel had confronted his deepest fears, shared his vulnerability, and discovered the possibility of trust, care, and love once again. By the time spring approached, Samuel felt a transformation within himself. The man who had spent 9 years in solitude was no longer defined solely by isolation. He had learned that connection required courage, that vulnerability was not weakness, and that partnership could bring strength, hope, and fulfillment. Ayanna had become more than a companion. She had become a guide through uncharted emotional terrain, helping him navigate the complexities of trust, care, and intimacy. Their bond continued to grow in subtle, meaningful ways. They shared stories of their pasts, celebrated small victories in their daily work, and found moments of joy in the beauty of the land around them. Samuel discovered that life could be both challenging and rewarding when shared with someone who understood, supported, and respected him. The lessons of solitude remained valuable, but they were now complemented by the lessons of companionship, patience, and mutual care. That winter, Samuel Hayes realized a profound truth. Life was not meant to be faced entirely alone. The hardships, joys, and beauty of the world could be experienced more fully when shared with someone who offered trust, understanding, and unwavering presence. Ayanna had entered his life unexpectedly, bringing with her not just companionship, but a mirror that reflected both his strengths and his vulnerabilities. She had taught him that even the most guarded heart could learn to trust, to care, and to embrace the possibility of love once more. The storm, both literal and emotional, had passed, leaving behind a man transformed. Samuel's solitude had served its purpose, allowing him to survive tragedy and build resilience. But it was the arrival of Ayanna, the shared struggles, and the acts of trust and care that had reshaped him. He now faced the future with hope, courage, and the knowledge that he could walk through life not as a solitary figure, but as part of a partnership rooted in respect, understanding, and love. Spring arrived in the valley like a gentle promise. The snow that had blanketed the plains and hills melted slowly, feeding streams and rivers that had been quiet all winter. The sun's warmth returned, painting the land with shades of green and gold, and the animals seemed to sense the change, moving more freely and eating with renewed vigor. Samuel Hayes and Ayanna emerged from the long winter, carrying not only the memories of survival, but also the lessons learned from the storm and their shared struggle. Life in the cabin returned to a rhythm, but it was no longer the isolated routine Samuel had known for 9 years. Every day, there was laughter, conversation, and small acts of care that filled the spaces once dominated by silence. Samuel had discovered that companionship was not just about speaking or sharing tasks. It was about presence, understanding, and trust. Ayanna's presence brought warmth to the cabin, and the quiet land seemed to respond to the life and energy they shared. Their mornings began with tending the animals together, guiding the cattle and goats across the pastures, checking fences, and planning for the day ahead. Samuel noticed how easy it had become to work alongside Ayanna, how naturally their movements and actions complemented each other. The simple act of sharing labor felt deeply satisfying, not because it was necessary for survival alone, but because it was shared with someone who understood, respected, and appreciated the effort. Evenings were spent by the fire, sharing stories, laughter, and quiet reflection. Samuel would talk about memories of his family, not with sorrow, but with gentle remembrance, allowing himself to honor the past without being trapped by it. Yana, in turn, shared stories of her own experiences, of lessons learned from her people, and of the travels that had brought her to the valley. Their conversations were no longer cautious or hesitant. They were open, filled with trust, curiosity, and mutual respect. Samuel began to understand that human connection could be both safe and enriching when nurtured carefully and patiently. As the weeks passed, Samuel noticed changes within himself. He felt lighter, freer, and more connected, not just to Ayanna, but to the land, the animals, and the rhythms of life around him. The fear of being hurt or losing his independence, which had once dominated his thoughts, had softened. He realized that true strength was not in isolation, but in the willingness to open his heart, to share responsibility, and to embrace the vulnerability that came with caring for another person. Together, Samuel and Ayanna explored the valley in ways they had not before. They discovered hidden springs, walked along distant ridges, and watched sunsets from high points where the entire landscape stretched before them. These journeys were more than physical exploration. They were shared experiences that deepened their bond. Samuel felt the joy of companionship for the first time in nearly a decade, and he understood that the land he had once believed was only a place for survival had become a space for connection, growth, and renewal. Their relationship also strengthened in the small, quiet ways of daily life. Yana taught Samuel how to recognize subtle changes in the weather, the signs of animal behavior that predicted migration, and techniques to make life more efficient without taking shortcuts that might harm the land or animals. Samuel, in turn, shared his knowledge of cattle tending, shelter building, and fire management. The exchange of skills created mutual respect, and the act of teaching and learning together deepened the intimacy between them. It was a partnership built not only on survival, but on shared growth, trust, and understanding. Spring also brought moments of joy and playfulness. They would race across fields, laugh at mistakes, and share meals in the open air, enjoying the sunlight and warmth after months of cold confinement. Samuel realized that these moments, simple and unplanned, were treasures, proof that life could be rich and fulfilling even in remote isolation, as long as it was shared with someone who truly understood and valued him. Yana's laughter, her quiet jokes, and her gentle teasing became a source of comfort and happiness he had not known he could feel again. Yet, the deeper transformation was not only in their relationship, but within Samuel himself. He began to see the world differently, with a sense of possibility and hope that had been absent for years. He understood that the pain of the past, though significant, did not define his future. He could honor the memories of his family while embracing the opportunities and relationships that life continued to offer. Yana's presence reminded him daily that trust, connection, and love were not weaknesses. They were strengths that allowed him to live fully. The valley itself seemed to mirror their progress. Rivers flowed more freely, trees bloomed with fresh leaves, and wildlife returned to areas previously quiet during the harsh winter. Samuel found a deeper connection to the land, not only as a place of survival, but as a place of beauty, inspiration, and life. He began to plant small gardens near the cabin, cultivating herbs and vegetables with Ayanna's guidance. This act of nurturing life was symbolic of his own emotional growth, care, patience, and attention yielding results that could be enjoyed and shared. Their partnership was further solidified when Samuel invited Ayanna to participate in decisions about the future of the cabin and the land. Together, they repaired fences, reinforced the roof, and planned for expansion to accommodate both their needs. Samuel realized that allowing Ayanna a voice in these matters was more than practical. It was a demonstration of trust and respect. He saw clearly that living together successfully required collaboration, compromise, and mutual support, lessons he had never fully learned in his years of solitude. Social connections beyond the valley also began to feel possible. Samuel, once reluctant to engage with neighbors or visitors, now found himself comfortable with brief interactions, often accompanied by Ayanna. Their presence together made these encounters less intimidating and more meaningful. Samuel discovered that connection extended beyond companionship. It could create confidence, understanding, and a sense of community, even in small ways. The culmination of their transformation was not marked by grand gestures or dramatic events, but by quiet, everyday actions that reflected the depth of their bond. Samuel would wake to find Ayanna preparing breakfast, and she would find him checking on livestock before dawn. They would work together, side by side, sharing knowledge, laughter, and quiet reflection. These daily routines, once solitary and mechanical, had become a source of fulfillment, joy, and mutual support. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the valley, Samuel and Ayanna sat together on a hill, overlooking the land that had been both challenge and sanctuary. The wind was gentle, carrying the scents of wildflowers and fresh grass. Samuel realized that the valley, which had once symbolized isolation and hardship, now represented life, growth, and connection. He looked at Ayanna and felt a sense of gratitude and love that was both humbling and uplifting. She had entered his life quietly, and through patience, understanding, and shared experiences, had helped him rediscover the beauty of companionship and trust. By the end of the season, Samuel's transformation was clear. The man who had once defined himself by solitude now embraced partnership, trust, and love. He understood that life's challenges could be faced more fully when shared, that vulnerability could coexist with strength, and that human connection was not a threat to independence but a source of resilience. Ayanna had become an inseparable part of his life, and together, they had built a foundation of understanding, respect, and mutual support that promised a fulfilling future. As summer approached, Samuel Hayes knew that life would never return to the isolation he had once considered safe. The valley was no longer merely a place to survive. It was a place to live fully, to grow emotionally, and to share experiences with someone who mattered. He and Ayanna had weathered storms, both literal and emotional, and emerged stronger, more connected, and ready to embrace the possibilities of the future. The bond they had forged was not fragile or fleeting. It was a testament to patience, trust, and the enduring power of human connection. And so, in the quiet beauty of the valley, Samuel and Ayanna continued their life together. Each day brought small victories, shared challenges, and moments of joy. Samuel, once a lone cowboy defined by loss and solitude, had discovered that life's greatest strength lay not in isolation, but in trust, companionship, and love. The cabin, the land, and the animals were no longer just elements of survival. They were part of a life shared, a life rebuilt, and a life that promised hope, connection, and happiness for the years to come.